So, in our studies of the life of Abraham, we've now come across one of the more mysterious and enigmatic figures in the Old Testament, that of Melchisidec, the king of Salem. Those of you who are familiar with the book of Hebrews will know that there is a great deal of spiritual significance attached to this individual. We almost have the opposite situation to the previous study we did, where we looked at the campaigns of the king of Kedorlaomer and Abraham's response. There was a lot of narrative to get through before you got to the spiritual points, whereas here there's not a great deal of narrative, but a lot of spiritual points, and possibly too much to get through in one study. Well, almost certainly too much to get through in one study. So I apologise if I do spend a little too much time on what may seem like technicalities and going a bit too in depth. But in my defence, the writer of the book of Hebrews does say he has much to say on this topic and it's hard to get through. So if he finds it hard to get through, I dare say it should be even harder for myself. That being said, this character Melchisidec, although this is an extremely short passage in which he appears, and this is the only part of the narrative of the book of Genesis and the Old Testament where he appears in the narrative, yet he has extremely important place in the plan of salvation, as we shall see. And so much so you almost sort of expect there to be more written. But as we shall see, the fact that there is so little written about him is part of what enables him to play such a crucial role in salvation, because he is a very important archetype when we come to the New Testament of Jesus. And so in this study, I want to first look at the question of who is this King Melchisedec. Then I want to have a look at the narrative that we read together. And then finally, I want to examine Melchisedec as a type of Christ and see just how significant he is. And just saying, as I'm going through, and we do get a bit lost in the details, and don't worry if you're not following everything that I'm saying, but just bear in mind that this is God's plan of salvation. This is something that he has planned. This is the thought that he has put into it. We have an expression, it's the thought that counts, when we're giving someone a present. Well, if it's thought that counts, then we should say that our salvation is the greatest gift ever. So if you get lost in the details, just marvel at how much God has thought through what he plans to do for us, and at how much more there is yet to be revealed. So, who is this King Melchisedec? We read in the book of Hebrews that Melchisedec means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. So he is king of righteousness and king of peace. Salem is usually identified as a early settlement on what is now Jerusalem. So from Salem to Jerusalem. Salem meaning peace, and Jerusalem meaning foundation of peace. That's not 100% certain and not necessarily confirmed in the Bible, but it certainly would mean that things are tied up very nicely. As to who exactly this Melchisedec is, there are mountains of speculations, and you could spend a very long time on it. Some people try to link him with various other biblical characters, such as Shem, one of the sons of Noah, Job, or even Enoch. Other people believe he must be some sort of angel or spiritual being. And another Christian position is that he is in fact a pre-incarnate Christ. Now you might think that these people are devoting themselves to myths and endless genealogies which prompt speculation, rather than stewardship of God's work, which is by faith. To quote 1 Timothy. And to a certain extent, I don't want to go down any rabbit holes there, but I think it is necessary to rebut some of these ideas, because not merely do I think they distract from the point of who Melchisedec is, they also, if we were to accept them, would undermine his role as a forebear and image of Christ. So, with trying to link him to other biblical characters, in Hebrews there is a big point made that Melchizedek is without mother or father that is named. He's without any genealogy, and therefore, if we try and then link him into another biblical character, that would then give him what the author of Hebrews is saying he doesn't have. That would tie him into the genealogies. That would bring him sort of back down to earth, as it were. So that's why we should reject the idea of linking him to another biblical character whom we know more about. As regarding him being an angel or some sort of spiritual being, this is also ruled out in the book of Hebrews, where we read that every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. We see then that to be a high priest, it is vital that you be human, that you be a human drawn from the humans that you serve. And therefore, if Melchizedek was some sort of spiritual being, he could not fulfill the role of high priest in this way. And therefore, if Melchizedek wasn't fulfilling the role of high priest, and Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, that in turn would undermine Jesus' role as a priest. And we face the same problem if we say that the Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christ, because before his incarnation, Christ wasn't human, and therefore couldn't, as Melchizedek, be fulfilling the role of high priest. And this is to ignore the fact that God declares of Jesus, "You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And Hebrews says that Melchizedek is made like the Son of God. Well, there would be no need for Jesus to be made after the order of Melchizedek, and for Melchizedek to be made like the Son of God if they were the same person. Those things would already be there. So it would be a circular situation which nullified itself. Who was Melchizedek then? Well, I think we should limit ourselves to saying that he was a human. He was a priest and a king of Salem, as we see, and he is obviously a godly man who serves the true God. Now, there are a couple of problems that people might have with this, and that is, in Hebrews, we do have the implication that, in Hebrews it says that Melchizedek is without father, without mother, without genealogy, neither beginning of days nor end of life, and that he remains a priest continuously. And so therefore people say, well, he can't just be a human then, if those things are true of him. But I think there the author of the Hebrews is not trying to make the literal point that those things are true of Melchizedek, but those things are absent in the narrative, and that it's the narrative that presents Melchizedek in this way. So in reality, he would have had a father and a mother, he would have had a genealogy, but these things are not given to us. And we understand that the scriptures are inspired by God and given to us in a certain way that he intends, and therefore it's the narrative which is given to us which presents Melchizedek in that way, which then sets him up to be this thing. And if we were truly to understand that statement about Melchizedek being without father and mother, without genealogy, having neither beginnings of days nor end of life, you're essentially elevating him to another deity outside the Trinity, without beginning or without an end, and remaining continuously as a priesthood. So you've elevated him above the angels even, who certainly had their beginning. And if he does indeed remain a priesthood continuously, well, we would expect him to be still serving today somewhere in the Middle East and to have popped up at various points in history. So we have to understand those points in Hebrews there to be about Melchizedek symbolically rather than historical facts. And So, the other reason why people might struggle with Melchizedek and the figure there is that he is presented as a priest of God, but he is quite outside the family of Abraham. Abraham at this time has been called and set apart by God as God's chosen vehicle to bless, and through him to bless the world. And therefore, it seems strange that we should encounter someone else who appears to be worshipping God just as well, especially given the amount of paganism in the land. However, we should remember that the focus which we are given by God isn't everything that God is doing. There is a danger that we have what we see before us here in the case of the narrative of Abraham, and think, well, this is the only way God is working at a particular time. It's this type of thinking which, when Elijah was being persecuted and ran off to a cave, he thought he alone was left, because he was looking at himself and all he could see was himself there as a servant of God. And yet God reassures him that he has 7,000 in Israel who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And similarly, we have in the Gospels, when the disciples see someone else who's not part of their group casting out demons in the name of Jesus, they rebuke him and they sort of proudly tell Jesus about what they've done. And Jesus says, no, don't rebuke him. If he's not working against us, he's working for us. If he's casting out demons in my name, he can't then quickly go and do something, speak ill of me. And so we need to avoid the danger of thinking that what we see immediately in front of us and understand to be God's work is all the work that God is doing. Also consider Jethro, who even many years later at the time of Moses was still there as priest of Midian and was still giving good spiritual advice to Moses and was worthy enough to be Moses' father-in-law. And this, I think, can be an encouraging thought. When we look around the world, especially if we're sort of looking at our own circles and what we might consider to be sort of, true Christianity, we can end up with a very sort of limited, narrow view of who is actually being saved. And I think, and we need to be careful about not limiting God's grace, that God does have people that we're completely unaware of, and these might just pop up completely in areas we're not expecting. And so we should never preclude what God is doing. We should never try and put God in the box of our perspective and say he's only working here where we can see him. Of course, that argument can be taken far too far, and saying, well, if God's not simply limited to our understanding, then obviously he's working everywhere and everyone's in a way serving God, and that's not supported by this example. Melchizedek stands out as one priest king who was worshipping God amongst many other kings who were showing no concern for God whatsoever, and amongst many other pagan nations. The people of God are always a minority in the world, and therefore we shouldn't use God's grace to his people as an excuse to try and sneak in some form of universalism. And so then, if we turn to look at the narrative that we read together. So, Abraham is coming back from the defeat of the kings of Kedorlaomer and his coalition. And just to remind you, Kedorlaomer and his coalition had come from the area known as Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq, where future empires like Babylon and Persia would arise. So Kedorlaomer and these other kings had come down, they'd fought and beaten the king of Sodom and his allies, they'd captured Lot and were returning back home. When Abraham had caught news of it, he had then taken his men and his allies, he had then gone and defeated this coalition of Kedorlaomer, rescued Lot and brought Lot and the other captives back. And so now the king of Sodom is meeting him in this location called the Valley of the Kings, or the King's Valley. Again, we're not sure where this is. Some people suggest it's the Valley of Kedorlaomer, which is plausible, but again, there's nothing we can be dogmatic about. But the first thing I want us to notice in this narrative is the interruption that happens. If you were to skip over, so if you were to read verse 17 and then skip down to verse 21, the narrative would make complete sense. You have the king of Sodom meeting Abraham, and then the king of Sodom saying to Abraham, "Give me the persons and the goods and take for yourself." So the verses 18 to 20 essentially are an interruption in the narrative. The king of Sodom arrives, and then Melchizedek appears, and he takes the spotlight completely. And the king of Sodom has to wait till Melchizedek's section is completed before he can put his proposal forwards. And I think this is an important message for us, that when we need to be ready to put aside worldly concerns for the sake of spiritual ones. And to a certain extent, you're all doing that tonight by being here on this very warm evening, struggling to sit through and listen to the things I'm saying. And especially considering the events going on outside in the world, you could all be glued to your TVs, finding what the latest developments in the Middle East are, or I'm sure there are many other concerns that you might have in the world which could easily crowd out this thing. So you're putting time aside to come here to be with God's people, to study his word. And so there is that. So you're following Abraham's example in that regard of putting aside the worldly concerns in order to focus on the spiritual. So that's the interruption aspect. Then in verses 19 to 20, we have the praise that Melchizedek offers to God. Well, he praises the God of Abraham Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and he blesses him that who's delivered the enemies into Abraham's hand. And this is an important point too, that after victory has been won, praise is then given. And Abraham offers the tithe to Melchizedek. It is so often the way that people remember or pray to God in times of trouble. And then once the trouble has passed, once the victory's been won, they forget and go back to their ways before. Whereas this is a reminder that once we have received blessing, we need to turn again and praise God for that blessing, and recognise that things which we may have accomplished in a worldly sense are in fact accomplishments that God has done. It is God that delivered Kedorlaomer into the hand of Abraham. And recognising it's God who is the true possessor of heaven and earth, not all these petty kings which have been running around the chapter. And notice also that the praise that Melchizedek gives works its way into Abraham's thinking, or at least reinforces it. So you see that in verse 22, Abraham says, "I've raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth." He refers to God in the same way that Melchizedek has just done. And so therefore there is a linking here between the praise that is being offered and the practice and that Abraham is putting in place going forward. So he's not just going along with the praise and then getting on with things. He's actually putting into practice the things which are being said. And then on to verse 21, we see the king of Sodom's posturing here. Remember that the king of Sodom was defeated in battle. He managed to escape the battle. We're not sure whether that was just a sensible retreat or whether it was cowardice on his part, but he managed to escape, and many of the other kings that were with him got slaughtered. And here we see that he's being here we see that he's trying to be sort of quite clever. He is on the back foot here. He is coming to Abraham, the man who has just beaten the army that beat him. And this puts Abraham in quite a strong position, really. In similar cases, other people in Abraham's position might have then used the situation to leverage political favour, even deposing the king of Sodom, saying to the Sodomites, look, your king ran away, deserted you, I brought back your captives, I brought back your possessions, I'm obviously a far better king. And so the king of Sodom here may appear to be generous in saying, give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. But it may well be that he's simply trying to reassert his authority. He's coming to this situation and he's trying to say, okay, I'm here now, I'm going to say how this is going to work. You obviously have helped out, so you get this reward of keeping the possessions, but I keep the people. And in the long run, it's the people that give the power. It's the people that will generate wealth, which will work the farms, which will serve the king. Just on a practical point, we have to remember that armies can only take away as much loot as they can carry physically. And when they have to carry their own supplies as well, that is limited. So although these cities would have been sacked, there would have still been possessions left in the city. So the king of Sodom is by no means leaving himself without possessions here in what he is saying to Abraham. So it is quite possible that the king of Sodom here is trying to leverage his position and trying to reassert his authority. But we see that Abraham has got entirely different concerns. And so then moving on to Abraham's desire to remain pure. So he has sworn, as I said, that he's going to take nothing, not a thread to the sandal strap, that he's not going to take anything of the king of Sodom's, lest the king of Sodom could say that he had made Abraham rich. Again, another potential motivation behind the king of Solomon's words. And so we see that Abraham here has desire to remain pure. And it's not that Abraham has a general hostility towards all the pagans around him. He did receive gifts from Pharaoh of Egypt. And he also has obviously a close alliance with the other people living in the land at the time. But he obviously knows of Sodom's reputation and the king of Sodom's reputation, and therefore wants nothing to do with it beyond what he can possibly help. And we need to consider this in our lives and our actions today, especially as we deal with money in the world. For example, we out of the money that we receive from the church, we can claim gift aid as a charity. And I'm not saying that is something that is wrong, but to what extent does the state then feel that because we should be a registered charity and receive a certain tax rebate, to what extent do they then feel that they have a certain control over us and ability to tell us what to do? There was a book that came out recently that's received probably equal amount of criticisms and praise, called Shepherds for Sale, looking at money that has gone into the evangelical movement in order to not necessarily outright bribe and buy off the teachers, but certainly to influence opinion and push more liberal agendas. And so we do need to be careful and think, how are we getting tied to and involved in the world? And what might the world think we owe it because of the things that we get from it? So how connected do we want to be in the things we receive? If we are working in a job, does that mean that our employer then gets to dictate everything we say, think and do in a job, and what Christian witness we might want to have there, because they pay our wages? But we also see that Abraham's desire to remain pure does have its practical considerations. There's the food that the young men that are with him have eaten already. And also, we see that although he wants to pursue this path of purity, he's not making his allies beholden to that. So he's saying that Anar, Ashkelon and Mamre should take their share and their portion of the spoils of war. And this puts me in mind of what Paul says in Corinthians. For what have I to do with judging those who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? But those who are outside God judges. Therefore put away from yourselves the evil person. And so we're not to expect other people to live up to all of our scruples and all of our understandings of the Christian walk. And we're primarily supposed to look in our judgments, both of ourselves, consider ourselves, and insofar as we are to judge, to do that within the church, that we're to judge our own matters internally. And so that covers the narrative section. So now I want to move on to considering Melchisedec as an image of Christ. And I think we need to start by making the point that we need a priest. That might be a bit of a funny thing to say. It's probably something we're not particularly consciously aware of, especially as modern Protestants living in the world that we do. Catholics, of course, say that they have priests, but even their priests are not acting as most priests throughout history would have done. They're not slaughtering animals and offering sacrifices in the same way. And so if we cast our minds back to how things would have been when the book of Hebrews, and even in Genesis time, how things would have been then, everyone had priests. Everyone would have had priests offering sacrifices to their Lord. It was therefore considered a complete norm for people to have a priest and to expect to have one, just as today it's seen as a very odd thing and quite a quirky thing to have a priest who's offering sacrifices, and indeed most modern people would probably view that as quite barbaric, killing animals to appease a god. And so we need to put our minds back into the original audiences of the Bible. And remember that actually we do need a priest. We are alienated by God. We have committed sins, and those sins can only be rectified by death, either our own death in separation from God, or the death of a suitable substitute. And we also need a king who can rule us and lead in righteousness. Again, might seem quite antithetical today to people who value their own independence and want to take credit for their ruling their own lives. But if we are to be biblical, we need to recognise the need for the priest and a king. And of course, I'm sure that most of us understand that, well, Jesus is our high priest. He offered the sacrifice of himself, and he is now seated in heaven, and he continues his priestly role there. I'm sure most of us understand that in a theological sense, but do we actually live with it? Do we have that consciousness with us as we're going about it in our day-to-day lives? Because as you read through the book of Hebrews, it's clear that this is something which is supposed to affect us and affect the way we think and act. And it is something that we are to appreciate, that we are to be grateful for. So reading Hebrews 4 verse 14. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. So we see there that there's a recognition of how great a high priest Jesus is, passing through the heavens, and Jesus, the Son of God, and that then the greatness of Jesus is then meant us to hold fast our confession, to hold on to our faith. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but in all points was tempted as we are, yet without sin. So we're not coming to a distant God who is so far and great and holy above us that we have no hope of ever relating to him. We have a high priest standing between us who is both the Son of God and also able to relate to us in our humanity. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So this reality of Jesus as our high priest should give us boldness to come before the throne of grace. We cannot hope to come by our own merits, and we cannot expect mercy from God without God's justice being met. Therefore, it is only through Jesus' sacrifice that we can approach God. It's only through his high priestly role that we can come to him. But because Jesus is such a great high priest, we can therefore come, and not only come, but come boldly and find grace in the help of time of need. And therefore, the reality of Jesus' priesthood should be a great comfort and a strength to us in our Christian lives. So we need Jesus as our priest. But in order for Jesus to be our priest, we actually need this figure of Melchisedec here. Now, I'm not saying that God couldn't have arranged things in a different way had he so chosen, but the way he has arranged things actually makes Melchisedec a crucial figure in Jesus' priesthood. Jesus can be a king because he is a descendant, humanly speaking, of David and of Judah. Judah was promised the kingship, and specifically David was promised that he would have a son to reign after him. But Jesus, coming from Judah, can't be a priest in the Levitical priesthood, because only the Levites can be a priest under the Levitical priesthood, and it was the sons of Aaron who were designated as the high priests. So you have Judah and David representing kingship, you have Levi and Aaron representing the priesthood, and you're either in one or the other. You can't be both. Now, to the Jewish understanding of the Messiah, this isn't a problem, because as far as the Jews are concerned, the Messiah is just a political figure. He's a great king who's going to come and re-establish the kingdom of Israel. And this is the understanding that many Jews will have today. It's the understanding that seemed to have been in place that we read about the Jews having in the Gospels. They were coming and trying to force Jesus to be their king at points. And even the disciples were asking Jesus at the end of his ministry if he was going to restore the kingdom of Israel then. So, are the Jews right that we should consider the Messiah as only a king figure, only the descendant of David? Well, even if we did have another great king such as David or Hezekiah or one of the other Josiahs that were to come and react to spiritual reform and establish a kingdom, and even if the Levitical priesthood would be re-established, that would not solve the problems of the world. Good kings have been and gone, and that alone does not put man right with God, and the Levitical priesthood alone didn't solve the problem of sin. Now, you might therefore think, well, that's what God has been doing for most of the Old Testament. Clearly, it didn't work. And so there's quite the popular view is that the Old Testament represents one way of doing things and that God did something new in the New Testament. Whereas we see that with the figure of Melchizedek, God has placed him here in the Bible prior to Abraham. Jesus' priesthood is not plan B, it was plan A. Melchizedek's priesthood preceded all the priesthood of the Levitical system. If we turn to Psalm 110, so Psalm 110 is the connecting tissue between the account we've read in Genesis and then the book of Hebrews. So Psalm 110. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod, your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power. In the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning, you have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And the psalm goes on for the next few verses to talk about God's wrath against the kings and how he's going to subdue them. And this psalm both calls back to Melchizedek. Remember that Melchizedek comes in a chapter where the kings of the earth have been shown to be subservient to God and his people. that God is able to give the kings of the earth into the hands of Abraham. And it also points forward to the Messiah, to Jesus. So that phrase there, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," becomes highly important. And we see here the undermining of the idea that the Messiah is just a political figure. This psalm is a messianic psalm. We see this where Jesus in Matthew challenges the Pharisees, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They say, "The son of David." And he says to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And so Jesus identifies this psalm with relating to the son of David, to the Messiah. And the Pharisees can't answer him and can't answer his conundrum there. They don't say, well, this psalm isn't a messianic psalm, it's not about the Messiah coming, which they could have done if, as a way of getting out of Jesus' challenge, if they didn't accept this as the messianic psalm. And the psalm is, in and of itself, clearly relating to a ruler that God sets up and puts the whole earth under submission to. It is addressing a ruler. You shall rule in the midst of your enemies. And it is talking about his executing the kings in the day of his wrath and judgment among the nations. And so this is quite clearly a messianic psalm about the political ruler. But it also has this line, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." So this king is clearly identified as being a priest. This completely does away with the idea that the Messiah is only a political figure. The Messiah is a political figure, but he is also a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. And so, because Melchizedek exists, it is therefore then possible for the Messiah to be both priest and king. However, it's not simply the case that the Christian writers or even God has gone through the Old Testament and found an example of a person who is both priest and king. He says, aha, see, we've got a priest-king, you can have a Messiah who is both a priest and a king. It's very crucial exactly where Melchizedek comes into the narrative and his interactions with Abraham. And the writer of the book of Hebrews makes several points drawn from this narrative. So, firstly, there is the point that it is Melchizedek legitimizes the idea of a priest being a priest and a king. So it might be helpful if you turn to Hebrews chapter 7. I said earlier that the writer of Hebrews says he has a lot to say on the topic. He begins comparing Jesus to Melchizedek in chapter 5, breaks off to tell the people they're not really ready to listen to this, and then continues in chapter 7, well, starting at the end of chapter 6 and going to chapter 7. And so we see in chapter 7, verse 1, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God." So we see there clearly a king and a priest. And then in verse 2, we see that he is without genealogy. Verse 3. "Without father or mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life." Now, at first, this may seem rather strange to us, especially as when we turn to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we find their great long genealogies placing Jesus in the line of succession of the promises. So if we have genealogies for Jesus, why is it so important that Melchizedek doesn't have genealogies? Well, remember that when it comes to the priesthood and fulfilling these roles, genealogies are a form of credentials. Remember that the Jews who were confronting Jesus were very proud of their descendant from Abraham, and they took the fact that Abraham was their father as a form of supporting their spiritual claims to being God's people. Paul, when he is writing and he wants to establish his credibility as someone who can speak as a Pharisee, or at least a former Pharisee, doesn't just talk about his conduct, but he also talks about being a Benjamite. He talks about his lineage there. And when the temple was being re-established in the book of Ezra, there were some people who came to claimed to be Levites, but their records couldn't be found, and so they were debarred from serving in the temple until it was able to be established whether they were Levites, whether they had a legitimate claim to being Levites. And therefore, to the Judaism prior to Jesus, your genealogy was a form of credentials. It showed that you had a right to be a part of the children of God, and you had a right to perform certain roles. But here, the order of Melchizedek is seen that there is no genealogy. There is no line saying, well, Melchizedek came and he was a high priest because he was the son of such and such, taking him all the way back to Noah or some other great figure. He is presented without genealogy, showing that you can be a priest without having the genealogy, if according to the order of Melchizedek. There is also no time limit on his priesthood. So he's said again in verse 2, having neither a beginning of days nor end of life, being made as the Son of God, remains a priest continually. And then in verse 23, the writer of the Hebrews goes on, also there were many priests, because they are prevented by death from continuing. But he continues forever, that is Jesus, as having an unchanging priesthood. Therefore he is able to save to the uttermost those who are coming to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And so whereas the normal priests, there was actually a designated time of service and an age range for priests to serve in the temple. But even that aside, the priests would inevitably end up not being able to continue serving because death would cause them to leave. Death would stop them. But Melchizedek, because there is no record of his death or his birth, just a statement of him being a priest, he is able to act as a model for Jesus, who is then a priest continually, and he is always there for us, able to make intercession. And fourthly, this Melchizedek is shown as being greater than Abraham. Verse 4, now consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verse 7, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying here that this Melchizedek is put even above Abraham and before him. And therefore, given that Abraham is seen as being the father of the faith, for this could hardly be a greater pedigree and a greater station to be called for. And by implication then, Melchizedek is even greater than the Levitical priesthood, since Levi, Abraham makes the point that since Levi is descended from Abraham, and Abraham pays a tithe to Melchizedek, therefore, in a sense, the Levites paid a tithe to Melchizedek, and therefore Melchizedek stands above the Levitical priesthood, having received a tithe from them. And so Melchizedek being a forerunner of Christ, and Christ being made after the order of Melchizedek, is not some afterthought of saying, oh no, we need a model for Jesus. He's specifically put here at this point in time to bless Abraham and to receive a tithe from Abraham, and to have these descriptions given about him, that he can then not only provide a model of priestship for Abraham, but a model which surpasses and is greater than the Levitical priesthood. So as I say, Jesus' priesthood is not plan B, it is the plan A. And I'd also like to make a couple of my own observations from the narrative. That when Melchizedek comes, he's not actually recorded as offering any sacrifice. He blesses and receives the tithe, but there's no account of him making an altar or offering any animal sacrifice to God. And that is a bit unusual. As I say, priests are very typical rough ratio have always offered animal sacrifices. And even non-priests before that, you consider Noah, Adam with Cain and Abel were offering sacrifices there. So all these figures prior to Melchizedek were offering sacrifices to God. So it's quite odd then that one of the first priests of the Most High God doesn't offer a sacrifice. Now, again, I'm not saying that the historical figure of Melchizedek didn't, but I'm saying that the fact that he doesn't offer one in the narrative means that the one true sacrifice for sins can then be offered by Jesus. If Melchizedek offered a sacrifice, that would mean then that other sacrifices, animal sacrifices, were already part of the Melchizedek priesthood recorded in the Old Testament. And as the writer of Hebrews points out, all the blood of bulls and animals, they can't take away the sins. And therefore, I think any account of Melchizedek making a sacrifice is deliberately omitted, so that the one sacrifice offered by a member of the Melchizedek priesthood would be Jesus Christ on the cross. And the other observation I'd like to make is that Melchizedek brings out a meal of bread and wine for those gathered. And now some people go too far with this and say, well, this is obviously a communion service that they're having. And that's pushing it too far. But I don't think we should discount the connection altogether. We have to remember that the communion that we have today was based on the Passover, which commemorated Jesus, the salvation from Egypt, of the Israelites. And so communion is based on the Passover, but then the Passover itself is based on the general fact that sharing of meals is a common part of human communion, human friendship. We often gather around for meals to spend time together. So sharing food and bread and wine is a way of joining together as humans. And it is also a part of many religious practices. And so underneath the layer of the Passover is this layer of the basic idea of sharing bread and wine as an act of fellowship together. And this act is going on there, I think, in the book of Genesis. Remember that many of these people have just been to war together. Many of them have just been saved by the people. And therefore, sharing this meal together would have been a time of special bonding together. And so, although this isn't the first communion service or anything like that, it is a foundational layer which is then built upon until we get to the full significance of the bread and wine in our communion supper. So, I hope that you've been able to take some comfort from the things I've said and the number of layers that God puts into his plan. You'll be relieved that I did omit some of the details that I've uncovered, but thank you all for patiently listening to me on this warm summer's evening. So let's close with a word of prayer before we have our next hymn.